Perhaps most people who are interested in books have either come across or even written some of their own fan fiction at some time. They've been inspired by the world created by an author, whether that's a fantasy world or the real world, and they've just wanted to tell new stories within that world. It's a great way sometimes to just get those creative juices going, but yet fanfiction does have a very negative reputation. It's typically known for being quite bad quality, it's degraded for being uncreative, and ultimately just not a good way to write. But why is this exactly? And also, what is fanfiction, and how does it differ from just simply being inspired by an author and their work and writing some kind of story loosely based on or borrowing from those original stories? These are the questions that I want to look at in this video. Part 1. What is fanfiction? On the broadest possible interpretation, it seems like fanfiction is just any work of art, maybe a novel, that is based on the work of somebody else. But this definition seems way too broad, because it would include highly detailed and faithful adaptations of novels, say from novels into films, and it doesn't seem like that is a kind of fan fiction. It seems like in that case you're just retelling the same story as closely as you can. It would also include much looser kinds of borrowing. It would include, for example, a novel like The Goldfinch that borrows certain Dickensian character types and puts them in a new context. And yes, The Goldfinch has those Dickensian roots, but it's certainly not fan fiction of Dickens. So while fan fiction is a kind of adaptation, it's not just any adaptation, it's a more restricted kind of adaptation. For a better definition and to work out what fanfiction is, it might be better to look at the kinds of things that people call fanfiction. Now the term is only roughly 100 years old, and it's typically used to describe negatively bad literature that is based off of the work of others, but where it's set in the world of someone else. Rather than just being based on it in the loose sense, it has to be set in the world that someone else has created. And there are lots of different ways that a fanfiction writer might do this. They might take some secondary character from a novel that they like and explore that character's backstory. They might try and write a sequel to the book or a prequel to the book, or they might just take the overarching world and tell a new story with new characters within that world. In all these cases though, they're borrowing heavily from the writer, and it seems like what they do is they set the story in the writer's world. A fanfiction writer who loves Lord of the Rings would set his or her story in the Middle Earth, and someone who's obsessed with Game of Thrones would set their world in the world of Westeros, or Essos, or beyond. But also, this definition doesn't quite work either, because it doesn't seem like it's necessary for me as a fanfiction writer to tell a story within the author's world. Let's say I really love the characters of The Lord of the Rings, but I want to see how they would react if they were put into our world. In this case, I'm writing a story that is based on all of those characters, I'm using those characters and that component of Tolkien's work, but it's not set in his world, it's set in our world. But this still seems to be a kind of fanfiction to me. So I think we have to come up with a slightly different definition, and I also think that however we define fanfiction, we're going to have to say that it's ultimately a matter of degree. It's not quite a loose adaptation, it is a kind of borrowing, but it's borrowing in a stronger sense than just taking little aspects of a novel. I don't think Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, for example, is fanfiction, because although she's using elements of Dickens, they're very subtle, small things, and really she's coming up with an original plot with original characters that just nods and winks to Dickens every now and then. Whereas someone writing a sequel to the Harry Potter books is clearly writing fanfiction. So for me, I'm going to describe fanfiction like this. A work of literature is fanfiction if its predominant subject matter is the literary work of another author. Subject matter here could include the world, it could include the characters, the themes, the magic system. It has to be something fundamental in that original novel, and that has to be the predominant theme in the work of fanfiction. If you're just borrowing little bits here and there, it's not clear to me that that is fanfiction. There's also a separate question about whether fanfiction has to be done as an act of homage to the original author. It is called fan fiction after all, and so it does suggest that the person who is writing it is sort of doing this as a way to sort of pay respects to an author that they really admire. I'm conflicted about this though, because some fanfiction can be quite insulting to the original authors, and I don't know how much this really matters in terms of the meat of the discussion. But it'd be interesting maybe in the comments if you think that in order for something to count as fanfiction, whether it has to be a homage. Let me know down in the comments. So in summary, here's my understanding of fanfiction. A work of art or literature counts as fan fiction when the work of art takes as its primary subject matter the literary world or characters or story of another writer and bases the work predominantly around these aspects of someone else's work. This captures the idea that fan fiction is a kind of adaptation, but that it's a stronger form of adaptation. It's not just loosely based on an original text. And so now on to the next question. Why is me choosing to write a story that's primarily based on the work of someone else bad? Part 2. There's nothing new under the sun. So I found one defense of fanfiction online that basically used the quote from Ecclesiastes that there is nothing new under the sun as a kind of defense of fanfiction. The idea here is that, well, most authors are in conversation with other past authors and they're borrowing from their works all the time, and there's no true originality in any of their works anyway, so why does it really matter if someone wants to base their work on someone else's? But to make this kind of glib argument, to me, seems to just fail to distinguish between borrowing, which can be intentional, sometimes unintentional, and fanfiction, which is a more radical kind of borrowing. I also think the quote is just actually false. I don't really believe this quote from Ecclesiastes in its full truth, the way that this person tried to suggest. Yes, there are lots of things that get repeated, there are lots of motifs and things that crop up time and time and time again, but ultimately every writer, when they create a story, yes, they're absorbing in stories from the past and all of this stuff, but they also have a unique set of personal experiences, and even if some of those experiences aren't original, which they probably aren't, they're always combined in very different ways, and so if they're a good writer, there's always something new within what they do. And so really, there are new things, you just have to pay attention and avoid the tendency that a lot of people have, and I think especially literary critics have, which is trying to generalize stories into these, every story has X amount of steps or whatever. Actually, when you pay attention, you find a lot of originality in stories, even those that are based on the works of others. But there is one thing that I do agree with this kind of argument, and it's that it points out something which is certainly true. Most writing does involve borrowing from others, and this is something that goes on in all of the works that we hold up as great works. And in fact, many traditionally published novels would count as fan fiction, and they have been lauded as well. So just because a work is based primarily on someone else's work, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily speaking an aesthetic defect of the work. In fact, one of the biggest critics of fanfiction in recent history, Anne Rice, arguably wrote fanfiction herself about the life of Jesus Christ, and those novels were highly regarded. Or consider something more classical, Virgil's Aeneid, which carries on the story of the Trojan War, but now focusing on a secondary character, and a Trojan, Aeneas, and telling his story. That seems no different than someone looking at The Lord of the Rings, really enjoying it, and writing a sequel to it. And all of these works are held up as either good or great or classic, and so it doesn't seem to me that merely being fanfiction is going to prove that a work is bad. And so this might lead someone to the conclusion that ultimately what we're getting here is a kind of classism, where if your fanfiction is based on the works of something that we regard as high literature, you get lauded, or if you're traditionally published, you get lauded. But if you're someone writing on fanfiction.net or whatever, or you're a blogger, then it's sort of degraded, rubbish work, you're an amateur. And while there might be an element of that, I don't think that really gets to the heart of why people think fanfiction is bad. Part 3. Authors against fanfiction. So as I said, while I do think there is some degree of classism or snobbery going on with the whole fanfiction debate, given that we tend to like it when it's of the classics, I don't think that really gives us everything here. And in fact, there's an important difference between Rice's adaptation or Virgil's adaptation, or anyone who is adapting a classic work, and someone who's writing fanfiction about, say, the Harry Potter series. And that is that the authors of these classics works and their families are long since dead. And so there is no one to really complain about the adapting of their works. And if we look at a lot of the actual critics of fanfiction, they are often living authors who either don't feel like they are finished with their works or actually haven't finished with their works yet, and so don't really like the idea of people trying to carry on the torch before they've even passed it on. A common argument made by these authors is that fanfiction is a kind of copyright infringement. Anne Rice famously made this argument, but also so has George R.R. Martin and Diana Gabaldon. Even if the fanfiction writer isn't making any money, they are essentially using heavy chunks of an original work in order to make something for themselves. And an extension of this argument, and perhaps a more humanizing one, is that these authors also view these works as their children. They are their creations. And so they can get insulted when they see people carrying on these stories in ways that they don't like, or they can see that another person has presented a character in a way that's insulting to them. And we see this, when we get TV or film adaptations of novels and the authors are horrified by the end product. After all, authors sometimes spend years or even decades writing a single book, and so it can be quite insulting to see someone degrading your work. Another thing as well is that most novelists write about things, even if they don't do it in an explicit way, about things that may be very personal to them. And so again, when you adapt and change their world, they can see it and take it in a much more personal way. I find this even as an academic. When you criticize some academics' works, if they don't have a thick enough skin, they can really take it to heart, and that's because their work is them. They take it as part of their identity, and so obviously they're going to be a little bit fragile, however unreasonable that can sometimes be. So there's a lot here. There's the legal worry, there's the sort of worry or the emotional worries about authors feeling like their work is their children, in the sense that they're not really done with their work, and so they don't like people to continue or delve into that work that they're not finished with. Let's focus on the legal issue though, because that kind of seems a bit silly. After all, fanfiction writers are not making money off of these novels, at least not when they're writing on these blogging websites. So this seems like a silly argument, but actually it's not. Sometimes authors have actually had issues here financially. An author called Marion Zimmer was a big advocate of fanfiction, and she encouraged her audience to write fanfiction for her Darkover series. But then one day she found that someone had actually written a story that basically had the plot of a story that she was working on. She reached out to the fan and told them that this had happened, and she even offered them a payment, an acknowledgement of this, but the fan replied demanding co-authorship of the book. And so naturally, Marion was less keen on fanfiction after this point. A similar thing happened with Anne Rice. She was worried that fanfiction would damage the sales of her book. After all, authors do make a living by their writing, and while Anne Rice might make a lot of money, a lot of authors don't make a lot of money from their books, especially now that traditional publishing is much harder to get into. And so worrying about this stuff is actually rather legitimate if someone can come in and start claiming a slice of the already small pie that you have. Obviously, worries about copyright aren't bothering Homer or anyone else from the classical period or even a few hundred years ago. But these worries are legitimate for living authors, and so this is one distinction here, and maybe one reason why people don't care when it comes to fanfiction about ancient or old works, because there's no one really that we can have a copyright claim on. That being said, of course this legal worry still doesn't answer the question, is fanfiction bad? It might be morally bad in a sense, it might be questionable to do it, or at least if you're planning to get to a slice of the author's pie, it's bad. But it doesn't say anything about whether it's aesthetically bad, and that's really what I want to focus on. Part 4. Fanfiction and creativity. Another argument that authors make is that fanfiction is bad for the creative juices, because ultimately if you're writing fanfiction, you're using someone else's world, their characters, and all the rest of it, and so you're not really being creative. And really, being a good writer is all about creativity. It's much better to have a novel that has a truly original and breathtaking idea, even if it's a bit clunkily written, than to have a beautiful, elegantly written novel that says absolutely nothing new and nothing interesting. And the thought seems to be then that if you are writing fanfiction, even if the writing is quite pretty, you are writing about nothing interesting and nothing new because you're just copying someone else's world. But I think this argument pretty much collapses when we consider that some of the greatest works of art count as fanfiction. And I think this is because, again, not classicism, but because people fail to realize that just because you're taking another author's world primarily as your subject matter, that doesn't mean that creativity stops. Some writers take the real world as their subject matter. Does that mean that they're not being creative because they're just looking at the real world, and so you have to basically come up with your own fantasy world every time you want to be creative? Of course not. What is creative is not the subject matter choice, but what you do with the subject matter. So for example, with the Aeneid, what Virgil did was he took a character from that who had a very small moment in the story and created an entire classic epic around this character. That's a great deal of creativity, and he's not really using anything from Homer there. He's coming up with a completely original story. Or take someone who wants to tell a story in Middle-earth. They're going to have to become very well versed in Middle-earth lore and all the rest of it to tell a convincing story within that world. And that takes a lot of research, just like if you wanted to tell a story about working in a factory, it would take a lot of research. And then they have to come up with something interesting, some characters. Maybe they want to borrow some characters from Tolkien's world, but then they still have to think about how would these characters react in this situation in a way that's consistent with what we know about them. And so there are all kinds of creative questions and decisions that have to be made even when you're writing fan fiction. If a fan fiction writer does just take material from someone else and does nothing interesting with it, if they just take the characters as they appear and make them behave in the same ways, make them speak in the same ways without doing anything, or if they just rewrite scenes from the book, then of course they're not being creative. But equally, a writer that writes banal stories that just describe mundane events, it seems like they're having a similar creative problem. It seems like the creativity issue has nothing to do with fanfiction, because you can be a creative fanfiction writer just like you can be a creative realist writer or a creative or uncreative fantasy writer. So this argument doesn't really seem to explain what is wrong with fanfiction. Creativity is at play whether the subject matter is the real world or when the subject matter is someone else's work. Part 5. Leave my work alone. I'm not done yet. One thing that came up in my research of these living authors who complain about fanfiction is that they often dislike people playing around with their works when they don't feel like they've done the works themselves. And this makes sense. I mean, there are cases where fanfiction writers, as we've seen, have actually predicted the plots and then forced the authors to go back to the drawing board to change their plots, which personally I think is kind of silly, because if the logic of your plot dictates things going in a certain way, you know, maybe it should go that way, and you can make really convoluted plot decisions when you do this. But then, given the legal worries that we talked about, maybe it is a good idea for authors to change their plots. But in any case, there does seem to be a frustration of some writers who feel like they're not done with their works, they haven't completed the series, or maybe they just haven't put the stories to bed themselves, and so they just don't want people doing anything with them yet. On the other hand, I found some examples of authors who are quite happy with the work that they've done. They feel a sense of completion with it, they feel like they've done all they can do with it, and when you get an author like this, they seem to be much happier to let their works go and happier for people to tell stories about and in those worlds. The best example of this is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was very open-minded about fanfiction based on his world of Narnia. Once he had finished the series especially, he said to one of his young fans, "Why don't you try writing some Narnian tales?" And to another fan, he said that there are so many gaps in the Narnian world, there are so many things that could be filled by budding writers. And so C.S. Lewis seems to implicitly understand that the creative work in his world isn't done, and that a budding writer who wants to tell a story in that world still has to be creative, because there are things he didn't do in that world. He's happy to put the stories to bed. He felt like he had told enough tales within Narnia, and so he didn't want to do any more work, but he did still see some scope for creative new stories and encouraged people to get on board and do that. And it seems to me that the big issue here is that Lewis is content with what he produced, and he felt like he was finished, and so he was happy to pass on the torch, because he really was passing on the torch. Whereas when you haven't finished a book, it can be frustrating to see people trying to snatch that torch off of you, especially if they're actually predicting the plots that you think are really smart and hidden, and they've already worked out what's supposed to be going on. And I do think this is a reasonable complaint for an author to have. You know, it must be frustrating. It must be like someone when you're cooking and they come into the kitchen and start doing things, they start adding things, and it's like, well, maybe I was going to add those things anyway, could you please get out of the kitchen and let me cook, please? And maybe it's that kind of frustration that authors have, and why they don't like fanfiction. Again though, this allows us to understand why an author might have certain reservations about fanfiction, but once again, it says nothing about the quality of fanfiction. It just says that authors don't like it for these reasons that we can empathize with, but it doesn't say that the works are bad. It's still perfectly possible that the fanfiction could be better than the novels that they're based on. Part 6. Fanfiction as fantastical writing. So we've tried several times now to show that fanfiction is bad, and the best argument really seems to be the moral one, which is that it can cause legal issues for authors if a fan writes a story that basically follows what the author was planning, and then the fan finds out, they can maybe try and sue them. And that is a serious moral problem, and so I do think there is some weight to the copyright problem. In this section, though, I want to consider one more attempt to talk about why people think that fanfiction is aesthetically bad. We've already said that it's not aesthetically uncreative, and so that argument doesn't work. So I want to try a different track in this section and focus on the idea that the problem with fanfiction is that it is a kind of wish fulfillment literature or fantastical writing. Now, by fantastical writing here, I don't mean fantasy in the sort of fantasy as a genre sense. I mean fantasy in the sense of someone who is just casually daydreaming and imagining this world that perfectly fits around their desires and doesn't do anything else. That's what I mean here by a fantasist. And we've possibly read fanfiction like this. It's the kind of fanfiction where the characters, for whatever prejudice that they have, just wanted the story to end a certain way, don't have the nous to see that the story couldn't have ended that way, and so just rewrite the story with their ending, breaking the rules of the world that was created. Here is a really good example of this that I read once on fanfiction.net. So I remember this Harry Potter fanfiction. I only got past, I think, maybe the first 3 chapters, and it was basically a story set in Hogwarts where Hermione was a lesbian in love with a Slytherin, Harry was a bisexual, half in love with Malfoy and someone else who I don't remember, and Ron was just a depressed, angry, borderline alcoholic. I don't know how he got alcohol into Hogwarts, but there you are. The writer really seemed to hate Ron, probably because Ron got in the way of their lesbian fantasy for Hermione, and they were clearly very disrespectful to his character. And the Ron that they were writing really just was not the Ron from J.K. Rowling's novels. To me, this is a paradigm example of bad fiction, and so it's also, in consequence, an example of bad fanfiction. This is because the writer is completely insensitive to the internal logic of the material that they are adapting. Why would Hermione fall for a Slytherin and a girl when there is no evidence in the text to suggest that she has lesbian tendencies? And as far as we're aware, most of the Slytherins are incredibly racist towards Muggleborns. It's just not very likely that Hermione is going to be compatible with a Slytherin or a woman. And yet this author had this wish that they wanted to have, and so they broke the rules of the world in order to just gratify themselves. This was also why they perverted Ron's character, making him into something that he isn't. Really, they didn't write a story with Ron or Hermione. They just created new characters with their names who look and sound like them, but actually they're just the phantasms of what their desires. And the same obviously holds for Harry and his bisexuality, as much as there is many terrible bits of fanfiction or worse written on Harry and his love affair with Malfoy. And now someone might balk at this and say, who are you to say how I can interpret a novel? And I don't have time to get into this in this video, but I don't think that anything goes with interpretation. I don't believe that you could just say anything that you want about a novel. Clearly, novels do have a set of themes, they have a plot, they have a logic, and anyone who actually spends time reading carefully can see this, and so you don't just get to adapt novels willy-nilly, and it's quite clear when someone is just projecting their desires onto a text rather than paying attention to the text itself. Now maybe I could do a video in the future where I talk about why I don't think anything goes when it comes to interpretation. Let me know down in the comments if you would like that, and I will think about it. But back to the main point. The issue with this writer and these writers is that they're actually not engaging with the work that they profess to love. Instead, they're using this work as a backdrop to project their personal fantasies onto the work. And they're bending that world and collapsing it around themselves and their desires about what they would like to happen in that world. And this is why when you read these kinds of stories, they make absolutely no sense. Just like people's dreams make no logical sense. Dreams can be very interesting, of course, but they're not necessarily aesthetically satisfying because they're just a hot mess. And the problem with this is that it is bad storytelling. It's just imaginative wish fulfillment. And we've all read stories like this. They're stories where the protagonist is clearly just an idealized projection of what the author would like to be, where the character is completely flawless and amazing in a world full of people who don't understand them. It not only makes for bad storytelling, it also makes for kind of narcissistic storytelling, because the world, the characters, and the plot all bends to the will of the author's wishes and personal gratification. This is what I mean by fantastical writing. Writing that is just the personal gratification fantasies of authors. If you're interested in fantastical writing and why it's a problem, I'll leave some references in the comments. There are some philosophers that have written on this. Iris Murdoch comes to mind in particular, and she was not only a philosopher but a novelist and has said a lot of interesting things about this kind of literature. And so it might just give you a sense of where I'm coming from with this notion of fantastical writing. So I do think that gratification, fantasy, literature is weak writing, pretty much across the board. However, I don't think that it is unique to fanfiction. It might apply to a lot of really bad fanfiction, but it's also going to apply to a lot of unpublished fiction as well. It might even apply to some published works of fiction. Think about trashy novels where the aim is just to please the desires of the reader, to, plump up their egos or whatever. You can imagine trashy love novels on the more feminine side, or you can imagine maybe even something like the James Bond novels on the male side. That doesn't mean that there aren't elements to these stories that are good and that are interesting about them, but it does mean that their central characters and the way that the stories are being told have these sort of idealized wish fulfillment characters that aren't really real human beings. They're just there to gratify the desires of the reader. And so yes, there is something to be said for fantastical writing in this gratification sense, and it being a bad form of writing, but it's not unique to fanfiction. It might be quite common in fanfiction just because one big motivating reason to create fanfiction might be that you were unhappy with the way the plot turned out, and so you do just want to break it to satisfy your wishes. But sometimes a text is flexible enough for you to make those decisions. It is possible, say within the world of Harry Potter, to tell an alternative story where Neville was the chosen one rather than Harry, because that was an open question in the story, and there's nothing wrong with going to that timeline and then following down the consequences to see what happened. Likewise, there are some stories where people's sexuality is somewhat ambiguous, and so it makes plausible sense then that you might tell a story or propose an alternative timeline where you explore what might have happened had they chose someone else. There are many interesting things you can do in all these different ways that you can jumble up a text, but if you're just snapping the story to gratify yourself, then more often than not, yes, you're probably going to be doing something that doesn't really fit with the original text, and really is more about you than it is about the work. Part 7, conclusion. So these are my views on what fanfiction is and why I don't think that it is necessarily a bad form of writing. To me, fanfiction occurs when you tell a story predominantly using the subject matter of someone else's world in your writing. It's a kind of adaptation of someone else's work, but it's not quite the same thing. Ultimately, I don't think that there is anything inherently wrong with fanfiction writing. There might be a moral issue in terms of the copyright thing. I do think that is a legitimate issue for authors to be concerned about. I also do understand why some authors might not like people writing fanfiction, in the sense that they might not like someone, playing with their children or whatever. But those aren't arguments to say that fanfiction is aesthetically bad. And the two main arguments for fanfiction being aesthetically bad, that it is uncreative or that it's just fantastical gratification, while that can happen to fanfiction, it can also occur to other kinds of writing as well, and so ultimately I do think that the argument collapses. Ultimately, the question isn't, is fanfiction bad? It's, is your writing bad? And that applies across the board. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think of my definition or understanding of fanfiction, what you think of some of the arguments that I've made here. If there are any loose ends that you'd like me to follow up in future videos, also let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra!